She texted, "Can't talk, in a meeting, every night at 9 p.m. I finally checked her meeting. There was no office at that address. Every night, at exactly 9:07 p.m., my phone would buzz with the same 4 words. Can't talk, in a meeting. Not 9 o'clock, not 9:15, always 9:07, like clockwork, like something scheduled by a machine instead of a woman who used to fall asleep mid-sentence while talking to me. I believed it for 11 months. On the 12th month, I drove to the address on her expense report, and there was no office there. There was a parking garage. My name is Daniel Reyes. I'm 36 years old. I teach high school physics in Sacramento, California, the kind of job that doesn't pay much but gives you summers to think, and thinking, as it turns out, was exactly what undid me in the end. My fiance's name was Alina Cho. She's 34, a regional sales director for a medical device company. The kind of job with a lot of travel, a company car, and evening client dinners that stretch later than they should. We met 6 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue. She was arguing with someone about whether pineapple belonged on pizza, defending it with a kind of ferocious, funny conviction that made me want to know everything about her. We started dating 3 weeks later. I proposed 2 years after that, on a hiking trail in Tahoe, at a lookout point she'd once told me she wanted to see the sunrise from. She cried. I cried. Her mother cried on the phone when we called her from the car. For the first 4 years, it was good. Not perfect. We fought about normal things, about whether to move in together sooner or later, about how much time her job took from us, about my mother, who never quite warmed to her. But it was real. We built a life the way 2 people build a life when they actually believe they're building it together. We picked out a venue for the wedding. We picked out a date, the following June. We picked out chairs, for God's sake. Chiavari chairs, gold, because she said gold chairs made every photo look like a memory worth keeping. Then, roughly 14 months before the wedding, something in the rhythm of our life changed. I want to be honest about how slowly it happened, because that's the part people don't understand until it happens to them. It doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in through cracks so small you convince yourself they were always there. The first crack was her schedule. Alina had always traveled for work, 2, sometimes 3 trips a month. Regional accounts scattered across Northern California. That part didn't change. What changed was the evenings she was home. Somewhere around the spring of that year, every night at 9:07 p.m. Without fail, her phone would light up. She'd glance at it, and she'd type something quickly with her thumb angled away from me. Work thing, she'd say. Client emergency. You know how it is. I didn't know how it was, or I thought I did. Medical device sales runs on relationships, and relationships don't stop just because it's after dinner. I told myself that. I told myself that for months. The second crack was smaller, almost embarrassingly small in hindsight. She started wearing a specific shade of lipstick I didn't recognize, a deep wine color. Not the soft rose she'd worn for years, and she started keeping it in a separate zip pouch in her purse instead of the makeup bag she kept on our bathroom counter. When I asked her about it once, casually, she said her sister had given it to her as a gift and she just liked how it looked. I let it go. You let a lot of things go when the alternative is imagining something you don't want to imagine. The third crack came from her best friend, Priya. Not because Priya said anything directly, she wasn't that kind of person. And I don't think she ever intended to give anything away. But at Alina's birthday dinner that October, I caught Priya looking at me twice with an expression I couldn't place at the time. Not pity exactly, something adjacent to pity, the look of someone carrying a piece of information they didn't know what to do with. I didn't confront anyone, not yet. I'm not a naturally suspicious person, ask any of my students. I'm the kind of teacher who believes the dog really did eat the homework more often than not, but something about the timing of that 9:07 text had started to sit wrong in my chest. The way a wrong note sits wrong in a piece of music you've heard 100 times. So I started paying attention. Quietly, not obsessively, not yet, just noticing. I noticed the 9:07 text happened even on nights she told me she was already home. Already in bed, already half asleep on a call with me. I noticed it happened on nights she was supposedly at client dinners in towns I could look up online and confirm had no medical device conferences scheduled. I noticed the wine-colored lipstick showed up on nights that ended in her coming home smelling faintly of a cologne I didn't wear and she'd never mentioned any male colleagues using. I kept a small mental log. Nothing written down yet. I wasn't ready to make it real by writing it down. Just dates, patterns, small inconsistencies stacking quietly on top of each other like sediment. The moment that cracked everything open wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday in November, 7 months before the wedding, and I'd stayed late at school grading midterms. I got home around 9:15, expecting the apartment empty. Alina had told me she had a dinner with a hospital procurement team in Roseville that night. Her car was in the driveway. I stood in the doorway for a second before going in, the way you do when something doesn't match what you were told to expect. She was in the kitchen, phone in hand, and when she saw me her face did something I hadn't seen it do before, a full body flinch quickly smoothed over into a smile that arrived about a half second too late. "You're home early," she said. Thought you had the Roseville dinner, I said. It got moved to lunch instead. I told you that this morning. She hadn't. I remembered the conversation clearly, because I remembered being disappointed she wouldn't be home for dinner. But I let it slide, the way I'd let 100 small things slide over the past 7 months. Because the alternative required a kind of courage I wasn't ready to have yet. That night, after she fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above our bed. And I made a decision. Not to confront her. Confronting someone before you understand the shape of what's actually happening just gives them the chance to build a better lie. I decided, instead, to actually look. The next morning, after she left for what she said was a full day of client visits, I opened the shared cloud folder we used for wedding planning, a folder that, as it happened, was synced to both our laptops and had been for 2 years. Buried 3 folders deep, mislabeled under a subfolder called Vendor Contracts, was a set of expense reports she'd apparently forgotten weren't private, submitted to her company for reimbursement. Client dinners, mileage, hotel stays for regional training, dozens of them, going back nearly a year. I cross-referenced the dates against my own memory, against the nights of the 907 texts. Against the nights she came home in wine-colored lipstick. A pattern emerged with a clarity that made my stomach drop somewhere below the kitchen floor. Nearly every night the 907 text arrived, there was a corresponding expense report for a client dinner at an address in Rockland, a business park about 25 minutes from our apartment. I looked up the address. It came back as a shared office complex, the kind of building with a dozen small suites. Mostly startups and consulting firms. I didn't go there yet. I wanted to understand more before I stood in front of anything. I should say something here about what those weeks actually felt like from the inside. Because I think people who haven't lived through this particular kind of slow motion discovery imagine it as one dramatic reveal, a single door swinging open. It wasn't like that. It was closer to standing in a house you've lived in for years and gradually noticing that the walls aren't quite plumb. That a door you always thought closed all the way actually leaves a half-inch gap, that a sound you assumed was the pipe settling has, in fact, been something else entirely the whole time. Each individual discovery was small enough to survive. It was the accumulation that nearly broke me. I remember specifically a Sunday morning in early November, 3 weeks before I found the parking garage address. When Alina made pancakes, actual pancakes, from scratch, the way she used to on lazy weekends in our first 2 years. Together, back before her territory expanded and her Sundays filled up with expense reports and catch-up work, she hummed while she cooked. She kissed the back of my neck while I sat at the counter half asleep. And I remember sitting there, eating those pancakes, feeling a wave of something so tender and so confused that I nearly cried into my coffee, because some part of me wanted so badly for that morning to mean the crack in my chest was wrong. That I'd imagined the whole pattern, that this woman humming over a griddle was the only real version of her and the rest was just my own anxious mind inventing ghosts. I didn't cry that morning. I finished the pancakes and told her they were perfect, and they were. But that night, at 9:07, her phone buzzed anyway, and she took it into the bathroom to answer. And I sat on the edge of our bed with the taste of maple syrup still faintly in my mouth, understanding with a terrible clarity that the two versions of her, the one humming over pancakes and the one disappearing into the bathroom at 9:07, were not actually in conflict with each other. They were both real. She had simply built enough space in her life to hold both of them at once. And I was the only one who didn't know I was sharing a house with two entirely different timelines of the truth. Before I called anyone, I spent one more night alone with my own phone, scrolling back through 11 months of that same 4-word text, just to be sure I wasn't imagining a pattern that wasn't really there. I want to describe what that actually looked like, because I think people underestimate how mundane betrayal can appear when you finally lay it out in a row. March 14th, 9:07 p.m. Can't talk, in a meeting. March 21st, 9:06 p.m., in a meeting. Can't talk RN. April 2nd, 9:08 p.m. Meeting running late, talk later. April 9th, 9:07 p.m. Can't talk, in a meeting. On and on, week after week. The wording shifting just slightly each time in a way that almost felt designed to seem natural. Spontaneous, unscripted, except the timing never wavered by more than a minute or two, ever, across 11 months. I sat on my couch at midnight scrolling through nearly 50 instances of the same message, feeling something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with grief for the version of the relationship I thought I'd been living inside of. I called my sister, Marisol, that Thursday night from my car in the school parking lot after everyone else had gone home. Marisol's 33, a family law paralegal, the sharpest person in our family by a wide margin, and the only person I trusted enough to say the words out loud before I was ready to say them to anyone else. How long have you suspected something? She asked, once I'd laid it all out. A few months. Really suspected, maybe 3 weeks. And you haven't said anything to her? Not yet. There was a pause on her end, the kind Marisol uses when she's already thinking 2 steps ahead of the conversation. Don't, she said, not until you actually know what you're dealing with. If this is what you think it is, you need the full picture before you say a single word. Or she'll just get better at hiding it. What I hadn't told Marisol yet, because I hadn't fully admitted it to myself, was how much this was starting to cost me. I want to be honest about that part, because the videos and stories that only show the cold, controlled revenge without the grief underneath aren't telling the whole truth. There were nights I sat in my car outside our apartment for 20 minutes before going inside. Just breathing, just trying to hold myself together before I had to sit across from her at dinner and pretend the last 6 years hadn't started to feel like sand running out of my hands. I thought about the hiking trail in Tahoe. I thought about the way she cried when I proposed, the way her hands shook so badly she couldn't get the ring on her own finger and I had to do it for her. I thought about whether that moment had been real, or whether I was the kind of fool who mistakes a good performance for a genuine one. That question, was any of it real, sat in my chest for weeks like a stone I couldn't put down. On a Saturday morning in early December, 6 months before the wedding, I drove to the address in Rockland. Not to confront anyone, just to look. Alina had told me she'd be in back-to-back meetings there that afternoon. A Saturday, which should have been its own red flag. Corporate sales teams don't typically run Saturday client meetings. But I hadn't let myself think that hard about it until I was already in the car. The business park was quiet, mostly empty on a weekend, a scattering of cars in the lot. Her car wasn't among them. I checked the suite number on her expense report against the directory posted near the entrance. Suite 214 was listed as a parking structure access point, not an office at all. There was no company name, no medical device firm, nothing. Just a stairwell leading up to a parking garage that served the building next door. I sat in my car for a long time after that, engine off, staring at a stairwell that had apparently been billed to her company as a client meeting location 11 times over the past year. I felt something in my chest go very still, not the hot flash of anger you'd expect, but a kind of cold, clear quiet, the specific quiet that arrives when your mind finally stops protecting you from something it's known for a while. There's a particular kind of loneliness in sitting alone in a parking lot on a Saturday afternoon, doing math in your head about how many nights you spent believing a lie, and realizing the number is somewhere north of 40. 40 nights of a text message timed to the minute. 40 nights of dinner going cold while I waited, or not waiting anymore because I'd learned not to. 40 nights of a woman I was supposed to marry choosing, deliberately, again and again, to hand me a small manufactured sentence instead of a single true one. I thought about calling her right there, from the car, and demanding an answer on the spot. I thought about it seriously enough that I actually had my phone in my hand. Her contact pulled up, thumb hovering over the call button. What stopped me wasn't strength, exactly. It was the memory of a case Marisol had told me about once, from her work at the law firm, a client who confronted a partner too early without documentation, and spent the next year fighting a version of events that had been carefully revised overnight into something far less damning than the truth. I put the phone down. I told myself that whatever I was feeling in that parking lot, however much it hurt, it would still be there tomorrow, and tomorrow I could feel it while also being smart about what came next. I didn't cry in that parking lot, though I wanted to. I drove home instead, past the exit I would normally take to pick up something for dinner. Past the gas station where Alina and I used to stop for slushies on long summer drives back when we were still new enough to each other that everything felt like an adventure, and I started building the case the way I'd build a lesson plan, methodically, one piece of evidence supporting the next, nothing left to assumption. Over the following 2 weeks, I pulled together what I could without ever directly accusing her of anything. I cross-referenced 11 client dinner expense reports against the Rockland address and found the same pattern each time, a suite number that didn't correspond to any real business. Submitted on nights that matched, almost exactly, the 907 texts. I found, through a shared photo backup account we'd set up years earlier for wedding planning photos that Alina had apparently forgotten was still syncing from her phone, a set of images she'd never shown me. Nothing explicit, just casual photos, the kind people take without thinking about who might see them later. A man's hand on a restaurant table next to hers. A selfie of the two of them at what looked like a rooftop bar. Timestamped at 9:04 p.m., 3 minutes before the same nights. Can't talk, in a meeting. Text arrived on my phone. I recognized him after the third or fourth photo. Trevor Ashcombe, a former coworker of hers from 2 jobs ago, someone she'd mentioned exactly twice in 6 years. Always in passing, always in a tone so neutral I'd never thought to ask more. I didn't confront her yet. I know how strange that must sound to anyone watching this unfold from the outside. How do you sit across the dinner table from someone for 2 more weeks, knowing what you know, and say nothing? I can only tell you that I needed to be sure, completely sure, before I said a single word, because once I said it, there would be no version of us that came back from it. And I needed to be standing on solid ground when that happened. The wedding deposits were the thing that finally moved me from quiet observation into action. Marisol, doing some digging of her own through public records, the kind of digging she does professionally for a living, found that Alina had quietly withdrawn our joint deposit for the venue 2 weeks earlier. without telling me, and redirected roughly $6,000 of it into a personal savings account I didn't know existed. Not the whole deposit, just enough that, if I hadn't been looking, I would never have noticed it was gone until the final balance came due. That was the detail that undid the last thread of my restraint. Not the affair itself, as devastating as that was. It was the quiet, calculated redirection of money we'd saved together for a wedding she apparently had no intention of actually walking into with any honesty. I called Marisol that night and told her everything, the parking garage, the photos, the money. She was quiet for a long moment. Okay, she said finally. Now we build the actual case. Not for revenge, for protection. You need to document everything, and you need to talk to a lawyer before you talk to her. I met with an attorney the following week, a calm, unhurried woman named Renata Ibarra, recommended by Marisol's firm, who specialized in cases involving joint finances between unmarried partners. Which, as it turns out, is a messier legal category than most people realize. Her office was small, tucked into a converted house near Midtown, with framed diplomas on the wall and a single potted fern that looked better cared for than anything else in the room. She had a way of listening that made you feel like she'd heard versions of your exact situation many times before and had stopped being surprised by any of it, which was oddly comforting rather than dismissive. I laid out everything on her desk, printed copies of the expense reports, a folder of screenshots from the shared photo account, a spreadsheet I'd built myself, cross-referencing every 907 text against the corresponding client dinner filed with her company. Renata went through each page slowly, occasionally making a small note in the margin, occasionally asking a clarifying question: when exactly did the deposit account get opened? Whose name was on the venue contract? Had I ever co-signed anything with Alina beyond the joint checking account? Renata listened to everything without interrupting, then set her pen down. You're not married yet, she said, which actually simplifies some things and complicates others. The joint deposits, the shared accounts, those are recoverable if you document the withdrawal properly. The infidelity itself isn't a legal matter between unmarried partners, but the financial deception absolutely is, if she took money from joint funds without your consent. I asked her what I should do next. She said, nothing dramatic. Don't confront her yet. Let me draft a formal request for accounting on the joint deposit account first. So there's a paper trail showing you moved to protect the funds the moment you discovered the discrepancy. Not after some emotional blow-up. I want to pause here and say something honestly, because I think it matters. Building a case while your heart is breaking is one of the strangest experiences a person can go through. I would spend the day teaching 16-year-olds about Newton's laws. Then come home and sit at my kitchen table cross-referencing bank statements with a kind of clinical focus that felt almost like a betrayal of my own grief. But it was the only thing keeping me upright. If I let myself feel the full weight of it before I had the full picture, I don't think I would have been able to function at all. The night before I finally sat her down, I didn't sleep much. I lay next to her in the dark, listening to her breathing even out into sleep. And I thought about all the ordinary nights that had come before this one, nights we'd fallen asleep mid-argument about something small and woken up already having forgiven each other without needing to say so out loud. Nights she'd rubbed my back through a bad flu, nights I'd driven 40 minutes each way just to bring her soup from the one restaurant she liked when she was too sick to leave her apartment, back before we lived together. I let myself grieve all of that quietly, in the dark, next to a woman who had no idea her entire structure was about to come down around her the next evening. I think that might have been the loneliest night of the whole ordeal, lonelier than the parking lot. Lonelier than the confrontation itself, because it was the last night I got to lie next to someone and pretend, just for a few more hours, that the life I thought I had was still fully intact. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't something I planned as a scene. It happened on a Sunday evening in mid-December, 5.5 months before the wedding. Alina came home around 9:30, later than usual, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a folder in front of me, the expense reports, the photos, the bank statement showing the redirected deposit. She saw the folder before she saw my face, and something in her posture changed immediately. The way a person's whole body recalibrates when they walk into a room and realize the ground has shifted without warning. What is that? She asked. I went to the address on your expense reports, I said. Suite 214 in Rockland. It's a parking garage stairwell, Alina. There's no company there. She opened her mouth, and I watched her search for something to say. The way you search for a word on the tip of your tongue that simply isn't there. I can explain, she said finally. I know you can, I said. You've had 11 months of practice explaining. I'd like to hear the real version, though, if there's one left. She sat down slowly across from me, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car alarm went off twice and stopped. I remember these details with a strange precision, the way you remember the smallest textures of a room during the moments that matter most, as if your mind is trying to anchor itself to something solid while everything else gives way. It started as nothing, she said finally. A work thing. Trevor and I reconnected at a conference in March. It wasn't supposed to become anything. But it did, I said. Yes. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It did. March, I repeated. That's 14 months ago, Alina. We picked out the venue in April. You cried at the tasting. You picked out the cake flavor while you were all ready. I stopped myself. I didn't need to finish the sentence. We both understood exactly which version of April I was talking about, and which version she'd actually been living. I know how that sounds, she said. I don't think you do, I said, and I said it as gently as I could manage. Which wasn't very gently, because there wasn't a gentle way left to say it. I think if you knew how it sounded, you would have stopped somewhere in those 14 months. Instead you kept adding to it. The lipstick, the texts, the Saturday meetings at a parking garage. Each one of those was a choice, Alina. Not one moment of weakness. 14 months of choices. She was crying by then, quietly. The kind of crying that isn't performance, that comes from somewhere real even when the person doing it has done something you can't forgive. I want to be honest that watching her cry didn't feel like victory. It felt like watching two people I loved. The version of her I married in my head on that hiking trail. And the version of myself who still, despite everything, didn't want to see her in pain. Grieve, two different things at the same table. I asked her about the money. The $6,000 moved out of our venue deposit account. She said she needed it for something separate, and when I pressed, she admitted, in a voice that had gone flat and small, that she'd used part of it to help Trevor with a security deposit on an apartment he was renting after his own relationship ended. I sat with that for a moment. Not just the affair, people's hearts do complicated, painful things. And I've read enough about human nature to know infidelity doesn't always come from a place of malice. But the money, the quiet, deliberate redirection of something we'd built together, spent on someone else's new beginning while I was still planning what I thought was going to be ours. I need you to move out, I said. Not tonight, but soon, and I need the deposit back, in full, documented, this week. She cried. I want to be honest that some part of me, the part that had loved her for 6 years, wanted to comfort her even in that moment, an old reflex that took real effort to override. I didn't move to comfort her. I sat very still, and I let the silence do what silence does. Which is force a person to sit inside the consequences of their own choices without anyone rushing to soften it for them. I never stopped loving you, she said. I got lost somewhere. I don't even know when. I believe that you got lost, I said. But you had 11 months of exits, Alina. 11 months of nights you could have told me the truth instead of a lie timed to the minute. You didn't choose me in any of those moments. I'm not going to pretend that choice wasn't made a long time before tonight. She moved out 12 days later, into a short-term rental, and Renata Ibarra handled the recovery of the redirected deposit through a formal demand letter that cited the joint account agreement we'd signed with the venue. The letter was 2 pages, clinical and precise, laying out the dates of the withdrawal, the account it originated from, and the joint contribution history that established my claim to half of it. There was no mention of Trevor. No mention of the parking garage, or the lipstick, or the 11 months of texts. Renata had been clear about that from the start. Keep the financial claim separate from the emotional one, she told me, the week before the letter went out. The moment you mix them, it stops looking like a legitimate recovery of funds and starts looking like leverage in a breakup. Judges and mediators, and honestly, exes, can tell the difference. And it matters. Alina returned the funds within the 2-week window Renata's letter specified. Quietly, without a fight, the way people do when they know a longer fight would only surface more of what they're trying to keep buried. I remember checking the account balance the morning the transfer went through and feeling almost nothing, no triumph. No relief, just a small, quiet confirmation that the math had, at least, been settled correctly, even if nothing else had been. Trevor reached out to me once, about 3 weeks after Alina moved out. A text, out of nowhere, from a number I didn't recognize until he identified himself in the first line. He said he wanted to apologize, man to man, that he hadn't known how serious things were between Alina and me when it started, that by the time he understood the scope of it, he told himself it wasn't his business to end things on my behalf. I didn't respond for 2 days. When I finally did, I kept it short. I told him I appreciated the message but that an apology addressed to me wasn't really the one that mattered here. The one that mattered was the 14 months of choices Alina had made. Night after night, choices he'd been a willing participant in but hadn't authored. I told him I hoped whatever came next for him involved more honesty than what I'd witnessed. He didn't write back after that, and I didn't expect him to. I canceled the wedding venue the following week. The vendor was kind about it, in the practiced way vendors are kind about things they've clearly seen before. I remember standing in the parking lot afterward, the gold Chiavari chairs stacked in a storage room somewhere behind me, and feeling something I hadn't expected to feel yet, not relief exactly, but the first thin edge of it, the way you feel the first cool morning after a brutal summer. The harder part wasn't the venue. It was the calls. 40-some invitations had already gone out, save the dates mailed back in the spring with a photo of the 2 of us at the Tahoe overlook where I'd proposed, and now I had to call each person and tell them, one at a time, that the wedding wasn't happening. Most people were kind, careful, unsure how much detail to ask for and mostly not asking for any. My Aunt Rosalind cried on the phone longer than I did. My college roommate, Dev, simply said, "Whatever you need, man. Whatever you need," and left it at that, which was somehow exactly the right amount of words. The hardest call was to Alina's mother, Soo Jin, who had been kind to me for 6 years in a way that had nothing to do with obligation, who had taught me to make her mother's kimchi jjigae over 3 separate weekend visits because she said a man should know how to cook something that mattered to the person he loved. I didn't tell her everything. I told her enough, that Alina and I weren't getting married. That it was Alina's doing, not mine, and that I was sorry, genuinely sorry. That it had come to this after everything her family had done to welcome me. She was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then she said, "I always thought you were the steady one." I'm sorry my daughter didn't understand what she had. I didn't know what to say to that. So I just thanked her, and we sat in a silence that felt like its own kind of goodbye. I didn't hear from Soo Jin again after that call, and I understood why. Loyalties in situations like this rarely survive intact, no matter how genuine the affection was beforehand. I think about her sometimes, though. I think about the kimchi jjigae recipe, written in her careful handwriting on an index card I still have in a kitchen drawer, and I wonder if she ever made Alina explain, in full, exactly what those 14 months had actually looked like. The weeks right after she moved out were the hardest, harder in some ways than the discovery itself. Discovery, at least, had momentum. There was always a next document to find, a next call to make, a next piece of the picture to fit into place. Once she was gone, there was nothing left to investigate. Just a quiet apartment with her half of the closet empty, a bathroom counter with one less toothbrush, a bed that felt enormous in a way it never had before. I went back to work 3 days after she left, because I didn't know what else to do with a Monday morning. And I remember standing in front of my third period class trying to explain Newton's third law, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and having to stop mid-sentence because the phrase landed somewhere in my chest I wasn't prepared for. A student asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, allergies, and finished the lesson, and drove home that afternoon and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Marisol checked in most days that first month, sometimes just a text, sometimes showing up with takeout and sitting with me while I ate in silence. My mother, who had never quite warmed to Alina the way I'd wanted her to, was careful not to say, "I told you so," out loud, though I could see the restraint costing her something every time the subject came up. I appreciated that restraint more than I ever told her. I found out, 3 months later, through Priya, who called me unprompted to apologize for not saying anything sooner, that Trevor had ended things with Alina almost as soon as she moved out of our apartment. Apparently the apartment deposit I'd unknowingly helped fund had been meant to be their fresh start together. And it had lasted less than 10 weeks before he moved on to someone else entirely. Priya said Alina had been devastated, blindsided in a way she never saw coming. The same way I hadn't seen any of this coming 11 months earlier. I felt something complicated when I heard that. Not joy, exactly. I don't think I'm built for joy at someone else's heartbreak, even someone who broke mine first. But there was a kind of quiet justice in it, an unglamorous, unforced justice. The kind that doesn't require you to lift a finger because the truth eventually settles its own accounts. 6 months after the confrontation, I moved into a small house near the school where I teach. A place with a garden I'd never had time for before and a kitchen table just big enough for one person to grade papers at night without feeling the emptiness of a chair that used to be filled. I planted tomatoes that first spring, mostly because a colleague at school gave me a few seedlings and I didn't have the heart to let them die on the counter. I hadn't grown anything in my life before that. It turned out I was better at it than I expected, which felt like a strange, small kind of proof that I could still build something and have it actually grow the way it was supposed to. I ran into Priya again that summer, at a farmer's market I hadn't expected her to be at. And we ended up getting coffee, the two of us sitting at a small metal table outside while the Saturday morning crowd moved past us. She told me, carefully, that she'd known something was wrong for months before I found out, not the full picture, but enough to feel the weight of not saying anything every time she sat across from me at dinner, smiling, pretending the ground under all of us was solid. "I should have told you," she said. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. But I watched you plan a wedding for 6 months around something that wasn't real. And I let that happen because I didn't want to be the one who broke it." "You didn't break anything," I told her. "She did that. You just didn't know how to hand me a piece of glass without cutting yourself on it too." She looked like she wanted to argue with that, the way loyal people do when they still feel responsible for things that were never theirs to carry. But she let it go, and I think some of the guilt she'd been holding onto quietly for months finally loosened its grip a little that morning. Marisol came over one evening that summer with a bottle of wine and the look she gets when she wants to have a real conversation but isn't going to force it. "Do you think she ever meant any of it?" she asked, once we were settled on the back porch. The proposal, Tahoe, all of it? I thought about that honestly, the way I thought about it 100 times in the months since. I think she meant it when it happened, I said. I think she got lost somewhere along the way, and instead of telling me, she built a version of our life that let her keep both things at once. For as long as she could get away with it. And the money, Marisol said. That's the part one can't get past. Not the affair, the choosing to fund somebody else's beginning while planning your ending with you and never saying a word. That's the part one can't get past either, I admitted. We sat quietly for a while after that, the kind of quiet that isn't uncomfortable, just full. I thought about the version of myself that had sat in his car outside a parking garage in Rockland 6 months earlier, holding the exact shape of his own heartbreak in his hands before he was even ready to name it. That version of me had been so careful, so quiet, so determined not to move until he had the whole picture. I was proud of him, in a strange, retrospective way, proud that he hadn't let the grief make him reckless. Hadn't confronted anyone before he understood what he was actually standing on. I still teach physics. I still tell my students that every system, no matter how stable it looks, is carrying forces you can't always see from the outside, that the real work isn't in noticing when something finally breaks, but in paying attention to the small, quiet signs long before it does. I didn't used to fully believe that lesson the way I teach it now. I believe it differently these days, the way you believe something after it's cost you personally rather than something you simply read once and repeated. There's a version of this story where I burn everything down the night I find that parking garage, where I show up at her office or at his apartment and make a scene loud enough for everyone to hear. The way Alina once made her announcement in front of a room full of people who never should have had to witness it. I understand the appeal of that version. There were nights, sitting alone in that new house with the tomatoes just starting to come in, when I wished I'd let myself be angrier, louder, less careful. But I don't think that version would have gotten my money back. I don't think it would have gotten me the quiet, clean ending I actually needed, the kind where I didn't have to explain myself to a room full of strangers, where the truth simply surfaced on its own timeline because I'd been patient enough to let it. I don't know if I'll ever fully trust the specific sound of a phone buzzing at 9:07 p.m. again. Some nights, even now, in a house she never lived in, I catch myself glancing at the clock around that hour out of pure habit, waiting for a text that isn't coming, from someone who isn't here to send it. I don't think that reflex disappears completely. I think you just build a life sturdy enough around it that it stops being the loudest thing in the room. But I know this much, I know what it costs to build something real. And I know, now, exactly what it looks like when someone else is only pretending to build it alongside you. I know the specific silence of a parking garage stairwell built as a conference room 11 times over a year. And I know that silence taught me more about honesty than 6 years of good mornings and lazy Sunday pancakes ever could. Because it showed me, with total clarity, exactly how far a person will go to keep two timelines running at once when they think no one is watching closely enough to notice. I'll take the quiet, honest version of my life now, the one with no hidden parking garages, no borrowed deposits, no timed texts, over the version I thought I had for as long as it takes to forget the sound of that particular ringtone entirely. My tomatoes came in heavy that first September, more than one person could reasonably eat alone. And I gave half of them away to neighbors I was only just getting to know. There's something in that, I think. Something about building things slowly, honestly, in full view of the people around you. And letting them actually grow into what they're supposed to be instead of hiding half of them behind a mislabeled folder no one was ever supposed to open. That, in the end, felt like the only real victory worth having.